So our theme this year is equipping the saints for works of ministry. I appreciate the film crew that's been here this morning. I got here at 7 o'clock this morning and have been talking pretty much nonstop since. And I didn't realize like all the emotional stuff that's just underneath the surface, and talking about abuse and oppression and all the bad things that are going on in the world. And it really actually fits into our text today. There are several truths that I want to bring up, and I think it's really important to understand. One is that good and evil exist together. There's extreme good and extreme evil. Sometimes it feels like there's one or the other, like one overpowers the other, but the reality is that both good and evil exist simultaneously. They exist together. Number two, extreme joy and extreme sorrow exist together. It is pretty crazy when we think about life. I was just talking to our crew about all the losses that we've had in the last few months. This congregation has experienced heavy, heavy losses. Some very good friends of ours have passed away. But yet in the midst of that, we have young life. I look around and I look at how many kids we have here. We're a small congregation, but we're a mighty congregation. There's extreme joy and extreme sorrow, and it exists together. There are certain things that we don't think about. They're just kind of subconscious things that happen, anniversaries, things like that. I asked Natalie the other day when Father's Day was, because that's a time of year that for me is absolutely horrific. But it's also a time where those two realities exist together. There's extreme joy. I don't want to rob that from my kids. But there's extreme sorrow for me that's tied to Father's Day. It's a date that I block out of my mind, to be honest. I had no idea when Father's Day was. I didn't want to look it up. I didn't want to know. Turns out it's next Sunday, by the way. Number three, life can change in a flash. Things can change really, really quickly. People can die, people can pass away in the blink of an eye. Births happen really quickly. Good and bad things happen really, really quickly. Life can change quick. Number four, I believe that we as a church, generally speaking, are ill-equipped to endure suffering. Right? We really struggle with suffering, at least long term. Number five, suffering is incredibly lonely. Any of you who have suffered, any of you who have lost loved ones or battled depression or had any kind of issues with suffering, you learn pretty quickly that it's a lonely place to reside. And then finally, number six, being weak actually makes us strong. And that's the point that Paul makes in our passage today. Paul, who, by the way, murdered somebody, actually murdered multiple Christians, because that's what he did before he became a Christian, had this crazy advantage of being able to have this vision of heaven. He describes it as being caught up into the third heaven. I'm going to read that part before we get to our actual text, because I think it's really important. Paul, by the way, is speaking in third person. He distances himself from that vision. Paul doesn't feel adequate to be able to talk in the first person, though we know he's talking about himself. Listen to how he describes it. I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Paul's describing this incredible vision. Paul's living in a world of pain and sorrow, and it's chronic. Paul describes that a lot in 2 Corinthians. Paul's constantly persecuted. Paul's constantly beaten. Paul's constantly starving. Paul's constantly on the run, hiding from people. Paul was enduring long-term suffering. Paul was equipped to suffer. But the flip side of that is that Paul was given this vision, this incredible vision where God allowed him basically an entrance into heaven. It's this indescribable event where Paul experienced something so great that he said, I was not permitted to talk about it. Paul mentions it, but whatever happened, whatever he heard, Paul wasn't permitted to talk about it. And then he goes on, and this is the text that was read for us this morning. On behalf of this man, I'll boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Do you hear what Paul's saying? Do you hear what Paul's doing? He's saying, I don't want anybody to think any more than me of what they already see and hear in me. I don't want people to build me up. I don't want people to talk about how great I am. I don't want this revelation that I had for people to be like, oh, Paul, you're so wonderful. You're so magnificent. God has given you this ability to have this vision. So we're going to put you on this big pedestal. Paul wants nothing to do with pedestals. Paul wants no recognition. Paul wants no honor. Paul doesn't want people to superficially build him up as somebody he's not. And then he goes on, he says, so to keep me from becoming conceited. Another word for that is arrogant. To keep me from being arrogant. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. The word for thorn is actually, it means like a large spike. It's something that was driven into him. It was painful. Paul wants this vision of this massive nuisance that was driven into his side. To keep me from being conceited. 3 times, let me back up. A thorn was given me in the flesh, or a stake was given me in the flesh. A messenger of Satan to harass me. The word for harass literally means to punch or to pummel, to beat. A messenger of Satan to beat me, to harass me, to keep me from being conceited or to keep me from becoming arrogant. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. By the way, this doesn't mean 3 literal times. This was an idiom that meant over and over and over and over and over and over again. I begged God to take this away from me. Now think of all that tormented Paul in his mind. All the things that Paul did in the past, all the persecutions Paul had, all the suffering he had, all the beatings that he endured, all the people who talked bad about him behind his back, all the people who talked bad about him in front of him. Over and over and over, Paul was enduring this suffering, and he's begging God to take whatever this thorn was, this big, sharp, painful thing that was in his side, this messenger of Satan, this voice that wouldn't stop. He was begging God to take it from him. Verse 9, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Isn't this a message that we literally don't hear in the church? Don't we hear the opposite? As Christians, we got to be there for people. We got to be strong for people. We got to be firm for people. We got to be there for them. We got to stick by their side and not show that we're sad, not show that we're weak. You know, as leaders in the church, we need to lead fearlessly, and we can't let people see our weaknesses. We can't let people know that we struggle. We can't let people know that we struggle with our relationship with God. We can't let people know about our weaknesses. Paul says the exact opposite. In fact, actually, it's not Paul saying it, it's God saying it. God says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul goes on, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. People speculate, they don't know. Scholars talk about what this thorn in the side was, this stake that was in the side, this weakness that Paul struggled with. Some think anything from sexual lust to persecutions to Some talk about Paul's eye problems that he had. We know that Paul had weak eyes. We don't really know what this thorn in the side was, but we know that it was agonizing, right? We know it was painful. We know it was chronic. We know that it was a voice in his ear. We knew that it was this messenger of Satan that was messing with Paul, that was tormenting him, that was bothering him, that was trying to keep him low, to keep him from being arrogant. Not only did God allow it, God said, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. My power is made perfect in weakness. Guys, we shouldn't be afraid of our weaknesses. If anything, follow Paul's example and boast about your weaknesses. Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses. He doesn't say I'm happy with weaknesses. He doesn't say I'm overjoyed with weaknesses. He doesn't say I love weaknesses. He says I'm content. I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. Sometimes I feel like life is just surrounded with constant mayhem, and it's exhausting. Natalie and I were out at United 93 yesterday. We went out and we're just sitting right before sunset. And we're looking out and it just hit me. And I started laughing. And she's like, what are you laughing at? And I was like, this is like this backdrop, this scenery, where this plane went down. I was like, this sums up my life. Like, this is an analogy for my life. This extreme heroism and this extreme sorrow and tragedy in the same time. I was like, a plane crash, 9/11. It's like, of all the places that a plane could go down, the one plane that didn't meet its destination, where does it land? In my backyard. It's like, this sums up my life. Like this constant, bizarre mayhem that just clings and follows me. There's bizarre, weird circumstances over and over and over. It's not just United 93. It's all kinds of really bizarre things. I had a phone call yesterday. Such a bizarre call, such a tragic call, such a heartbreaking call. This person's in Seattle describing somebody in California, and like just all these weird connections. And I was like, I know who you're talking about. I was like, I actually know your parents. He's like, you what now? This guy didn't know I existed a couple weeks ago. It's just, that's my word. It's constant mayhem. It's constant chaos. It's constant sorrow. It's constant brokenness. It's constant pain and suffering and struggling and oppression and addiction and all this stuff. You look around and it's just mayhem everywhere. And I think as Christians, sometimes we get confused in that world of suffering, and we're like, wait a second, God, why me? And God's answer is, because my power is made perfect in weaknesses. My grace is sufficient for you. Paul concludes, he says, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Sometimes you might feel weak. There are days when you probably don't feel like going any further. Days when you're weighted down, days when you're sad, you're anxious, you're depressed, you're tired, you're lonely, you're sad, you're broken. Listen to me. It's okay. There's power in weakness. It's okay to have weak days. It's okay to have days where you're sad. It's okay to have days where you struggle. Good and evil exist together. Paul had this surpassing, awesome, incredible revelation. Paul wasn't even permitted to talk about it, and Paul mentions it because he wants us to know that our life isn't summarized in suffering. That when we die, heaven is waiting for us. Paul saw it. Do you guys realize that? Paul was there. He saw it. He witnessed it. He was present. It's okay to have weaknesses, because when we're weak, we're strong. Christ's power is made perfect in our weaknesses. The message is yours. Go out this week. Bless somebody. Find somebody and bless them. Rest assured there are people struggling all around you. Reach into their life. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know that there's hope. Let them know that you care. If there's anybody who has any prayer needs or anybody who's not yet taken the step to put Christ on in baptism, we'd invite you to come up as we all stand and sing together.